let's try to boil down to the problem of justification and why I keep harping on this, why it keeps coming up in every debate. I mean, right? Like every debate with a pagan, every debate with a Protestant. Well, maybe not every debate with a Protestant, but every debate with an atheist, a Muslim, a Roman Catholic, we end up on this curious topic of justification and first principles. And we're going to look at some of the reasons why, according to well, he's not doctor, but Russ, this doesn't really work when we critique foundationalism, when we critique this. I'm trying to get this stupid thing up on my screen, so give me a second here. Where's the stupid screen? There it is. Screenshot. All right, so let's look at this. This is not very long, so I'm not going to be reading for a super long time, but hopefully everybody can see that. So here's Russ's paper. Hopefully that's, I can barely see this stuff, dude. My eyes are getting, I got boomer eyes. Boomer Davis eyes. Uniformity of nature. Let's start there. Now, what he's doing here is kind of picking apart various attempts in the history of philosophy and in particular epistemology, because as you guys know, after the modern period, philosophers shift the focus from metaphysics, which the ancient and medieval world kind of thought was the first and preeminent of all sciences. They kind of start with metaphysics. And then we get with the Enlightenment philosophers saying, well, wait a minute. To be able to make these claims about metaphysics, what's out there, what exists, what's real, kind of assumes that you have some basis for the knowledge claims, first of all. So we're looking for the question of epistemic criteria. What is our criteria of knowledge? What is our notion of justification? How do we justify our claims? And it's certainly true that Plato and early philosophers did talk about justified true belief, and that does continue into the modern period for the notion of giving good reasons for why we believe what we believe, to ground our beliefs. But you'll notice that with, for example, David Hume, the question, well, actually with Descartes, right, the question shifts to the notion of certitude, indubitable certitude with the cogito and whatnot. And with David Hume, we get a more precise, specific fleshing out of what this problem actually is. And it's a problem of logical entailment and the fact that we can't be circular if we're going to be empiricists or foundationalists, etc. And so we're going to have to be able to deal with this problem of knowledge and having a criteria of knowledge somehow, unfortunately, being in a box. Because how are we going to know our criteria of knowledge without having a prior delineation or knowledge criteria for our knowledge criteria? And this is what we want to see Manion point out with really good, clear lucidity. So he had been talking about why falsification theory wasn't really a good approach to verifying our beliefs in terms of evidentialism and evidential claims, sufficiency and proof. The notion of what it is to have sufficient proof is ambiguous. And this is what happens in epistemology. The problem of falsification is in the same problem as the rest of the answers. And so let's start with this question of the uniformity of nature. Now, universal propositions also make claims about nature, and I can barely read this. Future, I can't read that word. Future, we'll say instantiations of the subject. I can barely read it. But this is only so if nature is uniform. So this is Hume's question, right? He raises the question of induction or the uniformity of nature. How do we know that the future will be like the past? Since that's a principle that underlies the possibility of any science, right? So we're asking a pre-scientific question, a pre-epistemic question, a question that's prior to the doing of science, right? Which is the question of uniformity of nature and induction, that the future will be like the past, regularity of nature. But this only works if nature is uniform. Autonomous man cannot demonstrate the uniformity of nature. And by autonomous man here, this is in the context of empiricism. If you're an empiricist, atheist, finite human being that begins his reasoning process from the human mind, then we're in this problem of not being able to get to universal states of affairs and universal claims. Bertrand Russell explains this problem very well. It has been argued that we have reason to know that the future will resemble the past because what was the future has constantly become the past and always has been found to resemble the past, so that we really have the experience of the future, namely of times which were formerly future, which we call past futures. But such an argument begs the very question at issue. We have experience of past futures, but not future futures. And the question is, what future futures resemble past futures? This question is to be answered by an argument which starts with past futures alone. We therefore still seek for some principle which will enable us to know that the future will follow the same lines as the past. So you'll notice from the time of David Hume all the way up to Bertrand Russell, the exact same problem has been asked and restated. And it's a problem that plagues secular atheistic epistemology and philosophy because it doesn't have a way on the basis of empirical sense data to justify the belief that the future will be like the past. And the belief that the future will be like the past, again, underlies the possibility of any scientific endeavor. So what we're cutting to the chase here over is that science apparently is going to be, scientism is unable to justify its first principles and its starting point. Next, he mentions the deductive problem. Without justification for induction, which is what we were talking about above, right? The uniformity of nature. There are no universal propositions that can be justified. So we're not saying that you can't believe these things or that you don't say these things. We're asking for an account of these things on your own grounds. That's what we're asking for. And again, why am I talking about this? This is a recurring problem in every debate that we have, whether it's Matt Dillahunty, Trent Horn, T-Dump, the Muslims, Stefan Molyneux. It is always a question of foundationalism, evidentialism, empiricism, and the presuppositions involved in that approach to epistemology. So you guys will recall, every time I have this debate, I just simply boil people back down to this point and ask the same questions. So you'll notice in the Manion paper, he goes on to say, in terms of logic, autonomous man could then make no direct case for the validity of logic. Well, first of all, he can't because of there being no grounding for induction or deduction. He cannot even say what logic is. Is logic a substance? Is it a property? Is it a concrete and a particular? Is it abstract and universal? What is it and where is it? This problem is particularly difficult for materialists. And as you guys know, you've heard me make this point many, many times in the last 5 years, the debates with the atheistic materialists. Not having a category for non-material universal entities, atheistic materialists often suggest that logic is merely some convention, aka a social construct. And then they become postmodernists. They become ridiculous, right? Self-refuting. This, of course, makes logic arbitrary and destroys its universality. That is a devastating critique and problem in those systems. Metaphysics and logic are closely related. Exactly. A point that you've heard me make endlessly. Remember the debate with Vegan Gains and Ask Yourself? The whole debate was, you may not ask me any meta-ethical or metaphysical questions. Okay, but that's assuming that these domains don't overlap and that they don't assume one another. Do we know that, for example, a priori Eastern monism is false? Well, if not, then possibly all A are also not non-A, right? And there is no non-A. But if there is no non-A, then the laws of the excluded middle and the non-contradiction principle, are they even meaningful? How do we know a priori that monists, for example, are wrong? Now, he's not arguing that that's true. Okay, so I know we had some people who didn't understand what a reductio argument is, or making a reductio. They thought that means that you affirm the absurd position. No, this is part of logic and argumentation and epistemology, is to raise questions that are defeaters. It does not mean that you affirm that position. How exactly do we know that all reality must conform? This is the key question that's going to be a problem for, and I want to raise this issue because it keeps coming up, especially with people who are a little more philosophically astute, especially people that focus on ancient and medieval metaphysics, aka Thomists, etc. They will raise this question of retorsion, and they will think that qualifies for justification. But as we can see in a moment, I want to show you guys why simply arguing that I don't see how it could be otherwise actually won't function to achieve epistemic justification. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't bring this up. It is important to point out, right, reductios. But reductio arguments aren't strong enough or good enough actually to get us to epistemic justification, and we'll see why. We'll give the defeater for why that is in just a second. And Manion will make this point in a very lucid way here at the beginning, so there won't be much more reading. So he says, how exactly do we know that reality that's out there, all reality, conforms to these principles that we, individual humans, are calling logic? How do we know that there exists a world, in the world, a universal principle that says, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, that he must be mortal? Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear this and say, well, it's true. Clearly, it's obviously self-evidently true. But Manion is raising a different question here, right? He doesn't believe that it's not true. He's asking a Humean, or actually a Kantian kind of question. So let me bring up the next screenshot here of the next point, which is he's basically just restating a Kantian type of view, and he's not saying Kant's correct. I don't believe Kant's correct. This is an argument that's a defeater for that argument. Okay, so let's everybody get that clear. I'm not affirming Kant. It's just using this argument in the same way that we used Hume's argument above about induction and the regularity of nature, right? So what does this argument say? Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? We have already seen that the case for these principles themselves cannot be made. And he argued that earlier in the paper, right, when he was critiquing foundationalism. So don't accuse me of lying or not. It's just earlier in the paper. I started towards the end of the paper because this is where he's going to make the important point that I want to focus on today. Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to raise Kant's question that how do we know that our conceptual scheme, right, the conceptual categories that we have for logic and universals and math and all these things in our head, that they actually match up to things that are out there in the world? Now, I think that we do have those things. But what we're investigating here is this is a problem for an empiricist type of position, especially for an evidentialist, for this kind of a position, for a peripatetic axiom type of position. Because although we may believe that that's the case, we want to know what is the argument for that being the case, you see, without relying on the principle of induction, deduction, or the assumption that the external world matches up to my conceptual schema from the outset, right? So you can't just appeal to things in the external world or to your metaphysical principles, because what we're asking is a question prior to those principles, right? And he says, more to the point, induction and deduction are methods that presuppose logic, okay? But this is a meta-logical question that we're asking about logic itself. So therefore, any direct case for logic will necessarily be involved in circular reasoning. So the point of this whole exercise is not to say that we don't have empirical sense data or knowledge, right? The point is not to say I'm a Humean. The point is to say that on the grounds of empiricism, evidentialism, natural philosophy, natural theology, et cetera, and its epistemology, we don't have a justification for its starting points and for its first principles and for its assumptions. And their only response is going to be either a circular argument, which will be a defeater for their foundationalist position, or it will be to be arbitrary. Well, it just is that way. And I don't see how it could be any other way. All right, that's what I meant by retorsion, right? Where we say, well, you could deny first principles. You could deny the reliability of sense perception. You could deny the existence of logic. But to do so would lead to reality being absurd. And I just simply don't see how it could be that way, right? We've heard this reply from many Thomists, from many Aristotelians, many philosophers who are a little more astute. Why does that not count for justification? This is the key point here. And all I need is one or two defeaters that are great examples to show that it doesn't achieve justification. It doesn't achieve justificatory status based on a couple defeaters. Now, this doesn't even mean that the defeaters are the case. All we have to do is say, on your own grounds, I could propose this defeater to demonstrate that you still can't or are not justified in the assumption. So the assumption here, right, that we're dealing with now, keep this in mind, is that reality out there in the external world corresponds to our conceptual categories or schemes and the logic in our head, right? How do we know that it does? You might be tempted here, he says, to respond that because no counterexample could be imagined, therefore the universality of logic is undeniable. This is crucial. I have heard this from pretty much every Thomist or Aristotelian that I've ever brought this up with. In fact, today in this very chat, we had a Roman Catholic who was actually making this very point. If you guys remember a couple hours ago, the papal apologist that was in the chat said, I don't see how it could be any other way. Therefore, this is a justification of this question. And I asked him this very question. Keep that in mind. My question to the Thomist, to the Roman Catholic, was this specific question from the Manion paper. Again, let's get this point down. One might be tempted here, as the Thomists and the Roman Catholics did all the time and today, to give the counterexample that I cannot imagine any other way that it could be. Thus, the universality of logic is undeniable. But does the mere fact that we are psychologically disposed such that we cannot think of the world in any other way than logical categories justify us in concluding that the world therefore is bound by those categories? Do you see? Aha! You see the leap here. This is where the non sequitur comes in. Just because in your view, the mental conceptual schema and categories in your head appear to correspond to reality, maybe humans are just predisposed to read reality that way. You see, that's a defeater. Now, I don't think that. That's not my worldview. I don't actually believe that. But it's a perfectly rational, logical, and valid question to ask an empiricist or a person who believes in the peripatetic axiom, or an evidentialist these questions, or a foundationalist. Absolutely, it's a valid question. I mean, and if you think that you're going to get mad because I ask you these questions, well, I'm sorry. Welcome to philosophy. I mean, this is what philosophy does. If you go to university and you study philosophy, you're going to get asked these questions, and you're going to get pressed on these issues. You will be challenged. This is part of philosophy, guys. So we can't let our desire to have positions that we defend to the death for our ego get in the way of growing and flourishing in terms of expanding our knowledge and learning more via the willingness to admit that we could be wrong. So back to the Manion paper, let's look. Notice that he says that, again, let's grant that your psychological schema and conceptual categories of logic and meaning and all these things, that they really are the case. What we want to know is, how do you know that reality out there in the external world corresponds to that? Okay, this is Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction. Kant is really just sort of expanding on these questions from Hume, right? Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers via David Hume. And so Kant is the one who really pioneered this question. And I appreciate Manion's appropriation of Kant, not because I'm Kantian. I am not a Kantian. Nobody in the Orthodox world that I even know is a Kantian. Transcendental arguments do not come from Kant. He uses transcendental arguments, but he does not use the transcendental argument for the Trinity. Okay, so none of this is Kantianism. This is an argument that Kant makes that is perfectly valid, perfectly rational to ask an empiricist, an evidentialist, a natural theologian, natural philosopher. And if they don't like this question, that's not my fault. That's your problem, not mine. Why should we think that our psychological limitations are descriptive of the entire universe? Do you see how devastating that is to this assumption, to this presupposition? A psychological inability to modify the way that we think about the universality of logic does not prove it is in fact universal. These are devastating critiques to the strongest comeback that we have heard so far from people who try to give epistemic justification for their first principles by just citing and saying that it couldn't be otherwise. I don't see how it could be otherwise. Do you guys see how devastating this critique is? In fact, he says it merely means that we cannot modify the way that we think about it. If we cannot answer these questions, what are we reduced to? Many of us consider logic to be the bedrock of our worldview and our theory of knowledge. But what kind of a foundation is this, if this is what we're led to? Do I say, quote, I don't know what it is, I don't know why I believe it, and I don't know if it always applies, but it is the solid foundation upon everything else that I believe is built. Do you see how faulty this foundation is for anybody who's an empiricist, a natural theologian, natural philosopher, et cetera, et cetera? Anybody in this tradition, foundationalists, right? They are stuck with this problem. We are not trying to refute logic. So notice that Manion has the exact confusion and mistake that I have to explain to everybody. Do you think that this argument means that I reject logic? Of course not. I'm using logic to make this argument. We are merely pointing out the inability of man, with his unaided reason, to account for something so central and basic to the knowing process. You see, none of these foundational notions are meaningful or are justified individually. This is to say that in epistemology, there's no brute facts, right? The epistemic facts and propositions, we're saying, are theory-laden. They are holistic, epistemic holism. Rather, they all find their meaning in a worldview that is itself justified. Now, if you've been listening in today's Twitter Spaces chat, the atheist guy that was being pretty belligerent earlier, this was the exact point I made to that guy. There is no self-evident proposition or foundational starting point, even in just epistemic axioms or whatever you want to say, teleology, causation, that doesn't have its meaning within the context of the entire paradigm and worldview. It's a holistic exercise. And so when we are making an argument at a meta level, meta epistemology, meta ethics, meta logic, meta physics, that is what the transcendental argument is doing. It is in a different category than arguments that are just assertions or claims at the, you could say, normative level, or they're not logical claims, they're meta-logical claims. In other words, they are prior to the doing of logical claims or logical problems or epistemic claims. Do you see that this is a step up? These problems and others are what I refer to as the jumpstart problem. So here's another way, if people have a hard time with the way that I cash out this approach, think of this in the Manion exercise, the Manion paper here, as a jumpstart. How do we jumpstart the foundations of our epistemology? And this is why earlier in the chat I was raising the question of the criterion problem. What is the criterion for our knowledge criterion? You see. This is a perfectly valid question to ask. It's in any epistemology textbook. It's not some word salad I made up that people are getting all mad about. It's a very well-known problem in epistemology. And I'm sorry if you don't like me asking that. It's not my fault. And so he's just calling it the jumpstart problem to help give, a pedagogical device to understand what it is. At this point, it becomes clear that the autonomous philosophers have been reduced to wild guesses as to their foundations. That's exactly what you guys heard me arguing with the atheists today in the chat. Most people hold all of the above listed beliefs. Exactly, right? Do I disagree with the principle of causation, teleology, the external world, the self, ethics, morals? Am I a skeptic? No, right? But when it comes to giving an account and justifying the belief in these first principles, that is absolutely necessary and essential for apologetics. Because I'm not going to allow my opponent in the debate, be he an atheist, be he a Roman Catholic, I'm not just going to grant him his assumptions. If you just grant me my starting points, I will build my system. Why would I grant you your assumptions in the domain of philosophy and debate? This is ridiculous. Did Socrates just grant everybody their assumptions, or did he question assumptions, right? This is philosophy. So if you don't like that, I'm sorry. That's just what philosophy does. It's a rigorous questioning discipline. and especially the domain of epistemology and the questions of justification. So he says, at this big, he says that autonomous philosophers, this is what we're trying to illustrate, is that the history of secular autonomous philosophy is a dead end. And the history of philosophy bears that out. Most people do believe all these things, but they do so as articles of faith. Exactly. That's why I just bring this back to every time a Roman Catholic natural philosophy proponent says that these principles they're just self-evident. Like, oh, so that's a fideistic leap that you want me to make to accept your founding axioms and first principles. Maybe they're true. Okay, but why should I accept those and not some other? And if he begins to give reasons why, now he's introducing a new criteria of knowledge. But the original question was there simply to ask, what is the knowledge criterion first? Itself. What is the justification for your criteria of knowledge? Oh, let me give you this criteria of knowledge. Okay, what is the justification for that criteria? This is called the delineation problem, right? Now you have a list, tiers of how to put what beliefs, what knowledge claims into what box. So that's a prior categorization that now also requires a justification and can be asked the same question. Well, how do you know that that delineation criteria is correct? And thus ad infinitum. And that's why they don't like the ad infinitum problem, right? Remember in the Trent debate, Trent said, cogito ergo sum, it just is. It's just self-evident. Okay, well, can I just assert any self-evident principle? And he would say, no, it has to be consistent. Oh, so now you've added a second criteria for what it counts to be a self-evident principle. You see, he's starting now to rely on things that are not self-evident to justify the first principle that supposedly is self-evident. And if it's relying on other principles for its justification, then it is no longer self-evident. By definition, self-evidence means does not rely on other beliefs or propositions for its justification. And I even explained this in the debate with Trent. And none of the Roman Catholics seem to be able to grasp this point. In fact, none of the people I've debated seem to be able to grasp this point. I don't even think it's a very difficult abstract point. I've asked this to Azra Rashid. I've asked it to Stefan Molyneux. I asked it to Matt Dillahunty. I asked it to T-Dump. I asked it to Trent Horn. I asked it to the Roman Catholic today in the Discord. He wanted to debate about, not Discord, Twitter. He wanted to debate about the papacy. And I said, well, can I ask you about the epistemic certitude that you have for the infallible papal statements? Where is the list? Well, there's not a list. Okay. How do you know that you have the certitude that you think you have as an individual Roman Catholic for parsing out the infallible and the non-infallible statements of the papacy? I said, what is your principle that you would apply to know that? I kid you not. He said, the papacy. That is a circular argument. Now, if you're a foundationalist, which inherently by necessity a Roman Catholic must be because they have adopted a foundationalist epistemology, natural theology rests on this kind of a view, you can't make a circular argument, you see. So this is pointing out that this is a dead end either way they go. If they assert circular argumentation, then they're admitting my point about epistemic holism and webs of beliefs, and that reality and propositions and beliefs are theory-laden. And if they admit that, then they have to go in my direction. If, however, they think that their propositions are just simply self-evident, and then when I ask them why I should accept those self-evident principles, they start to give other reasons and criteria for that being self-evident, then they are no longer self-evident. And they are violating the notion of what self-evidence is, you see. Because it can't be an infinite regress. You can't just keep saying, well, this proposition is justified by this proposition, which is justified by this proposition, you see. And this, in fact, is why people moved out of strong foundationalism into what they call weak foundationalism, where they said, well, yeah, we can't really resolve that problem, so we'll just say that justified beliefs are the ones that have sufficient proof and evidence. Now, who is so naive as to think that is itself a self-evident principle? Well, we all know what sufficient proof and evidence is, don't we? Do you see how silly and low IQ this reply is? it's again begging the question, okay, what counts as sufficient proof and evidence without being arbitrary? Oh, well, when the data matches up to the facts. Again, begging the question, because that's not answering the criterion problem. Right. Do you guys see this? Given the problems, Manion goes on to say, discussed thus far, many contemporary philosophers such as Nietzsche, Quine, Rorty, Unger, Harman, Lehrer, and others became skeptics as to the possibility of objective truth. According to Richard Boyd, the consensus among philosophers of science is that foundationalist conceptions of knowledge in general and of scientific knowledge in particular are untenable. Exactly. Now, I'm not saying it's true because this guy said it. He's just expressing the contemporary attitude. Yeah, exactly. When you're a secular atheist academic and you're honest with yourself, you're going to realize that this whole schema doesn't work. It's a dead end, a failed enterprise. And if you give up on justification, then you give up debate. You give up the possibility of arguing and proving Christianity false, atheists. So bite the bullet if you're going to give up your foundationalist enterprise. Then you have to drop the microphone. You have nothing to say into the microphone against the Christian. You have no argument at all. There is no argument at all. There is no argumentation at all, because argumentation presupposes logic, universality, induction, deduction, abstract entities, etc., etc., etc. To quote West Side Story. I'm just joking, by the way. All right, if you would hit like and share, we're getting deeper and deeper into the Russ Manion paper. Now, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias also has an excellent paper going even deeper into this justification quagmire in regard to Quine. Because as you guys know, we lectured through Quine's two dogmas a couple times in the last few weeks. And we need to get Father Deacon back on here because his critique of Quine is an even deeper investigation into this topic. It's even better because, as we know, Quine just basically says, look, we got to give up this whole idea of self-evidence, foundationalism, and starting points, right? We saw throughout the two dogmas that Quine has the circle, right? The circle just shows that whenever we start talking about what is analytic, analyticity ends up being definitions of words. Definitions of words end up being explained by people who do like write dictionaries, lexicographers, and they end up telling us what it is by definition, right? And that ends up being what, so it's a big circle, right? Remember that from the Quine lectures, it just resulted in a circle. And so these things result in a circle, then it begs the question for an empiricist, and remember the logical positivist, and he chose Carnap as his example, they're empiricists, okay? They are super duper empiricists. It's pure sense data, okay? Now, if you're an empiricist and you wanted to maintain the validity of logic, math, and these things, science and so forth, on the basis of the analytic synthetic distinction, then Quine's paper showed that actually this all breaks down, right? On empiricist grounds, there's not a basis for the analytic synthetic distinction. It breaks down. And that's what his paper demonstrates. And again, it's all just reasserting the various arguments of Hume and Kant. And that does not mean that we adopt Hume and Kant's philosophy or worldview. Why am I doing all this? Why am I talking about? Who cares about this boring philosophy stuff? Well, because of this. The whole point of the transcendental argument is to point you to this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom instruction. So biblical epistemology, revelational epistemology, which Father Deacon argues for very well in his paper, is making the argument that we're not going to be able to construct a human system that will resolve or solve the perennial questions of philosophy, and especially the last 500 years of epistemology. That's the point. That the paradigm as a whole of non-believing, non-Christian worldviews are subject to devolution and digression into these boxes of contradiction and unsolvable dilemmas that are so contradictory, not just that they're wrong, but they actually make knowledge impossible. That is the argument. That's the strength of the transcendental argument, is that you must begin your reasoning with the fear of the Lord. And if you don't have that, it doesn't mean that everything you believe is wrong. It means, to translate it into philosophical language, you can't give an account for it. So you can tell me all day long about how you believe in teleology and causation, and you love Plato, and you love Aristotle's first mover, and blah, 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 blah. And that's all well and good. But all I have to do is ask you David Hume's questions. And you can tell me that you think Hume is incoherent, and I would agree with you that his worldview is false. But how do you answer his objections on causation, induction, deduction, regulative nature, etc., on your view? How many times have we repeated the peripatetic axiom? There is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. Okay. How am I supposed to know that that's the truth, or accept that as a first principle, when that first principle itself is not in sense data and violates its own principle? Does that mean that I don't believe in sense data? No. I'm just questioning your jump start, your starting point. Okay. So we got a lot of slow boys out there who can't follow this point. Okay. We're not affirming skepticism. And by the way, me using an argument from David Hume does not make me a Humean atheist any more than Roman Catholics using Aristotle and first cause makes them Aristotelians. If I use an argument from Van Til, it doesn't make me a Calvinist. Okay? Do people not understand this? That people's arguments are different than the person making the argument? And by the way, that's called the genetic fallacy. So the people out here rambling, they don't even know what the fallacies are. We got a couple super chats I'll read real quick. Orthodox Hungarian says for $5, is Descartes' argument about the cogito circular, and is circularity a problem for some arguments and not for others? Yes. So Descartes' cogito is circular, but the problem is that Descartes is kind of the arch big daddy of foundationalism. So in epistemology, you have this idea of strong foundationalism, and the idea is let's search for the most certain, totally indubitable starting point principle to build a philosophy from. So if you read the Meditations, right, that's what Descartes' after. And he's does this sort of whittling down, boiling down position, and he thinks he's come to what is the self-evident, indubitable starting point, right, which is the cogito. But the problem is that, as again many philosophers after that have shown with a good bit of ease, it's not very difficult, especially Kant, the cogito isn't actually an indubitable starting point. In fact, it assumes all kinds of things. It assumes that words have meaning. It assumes an epistemology. It assumes that it assumes time determination, right? When you say occurrence, things occurring refers to time determinants. And so Kant says that, well, Descartes, you're questioning things, but you didn't question time. So you want to find the most indubitable starting point. You want to question everything, but you didn't question language, time. I mean, there's all these things and it's also a non sequitur, right? The fact that there's an occurring or a thinking, I think some philosophers have said if you wanted to argue it, really all it would be arguing is that thinking is occurring. Okay. The fact that there's thinking doesn't necessarily give you, especially in terms of a jump start, right? In terms of the jump start critique of Manion, the fact that thinking is occurring, that doesn't prove you that you're a self. Okay. What do you even mean by I? I think, therefore I am. I mean, maybe you're a self, but you can't cheat Descartes. And if you're going to say I'm looking for the indubitable self-evident starting point, you can't rely on all these other principles and say, oh, yeah, well, see, all those things are also self-evident. That's cheating on your own grounds, you see. So it's no longer a self-evident, indubitable starting point if it requires all of these other metaphysical principles, language, meaning, the self, time determination, logical entailment. Do you see how that doesn't work? So then you said, well, what about other questions that are circular, right? That's why we're arguing that at a meta level, meta ethics, meta epistemology, meta logic, the questions become circular. And that's what I was intending to address. And actually in the sections of the Manion paper that we read, we did address that. Because Manion's point was that, isn't it obvious from all of these disputes and dead ends in epistemology that there isn't a foundationalist out? Scientism, empiricism, classical theism are empiricist enterprises. And if you're going to be an empiricist, as the beginning point of your epistemology, which I pointed out to Trent, if you're going to have the peripatetic axiom, which Aquinas does, there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, then you're going to have to be consistent with that. And all we're doing is we're calling the Thomist to the exact consistency that we're calling Descartes to. They have different approaches and different systems, but they're both foundationalist. Totally. And let's make another point that always trips people up. Saying that a belief is foundational to another belief does not mean that you're a foundationalist. Those are different things. So I believe the transcendental categories are foundational to the possibility of beliefs or knowledge at all. That doesn't make me a foundationalist. Two totally different things. Because foundationalists are not epistemic holists. They do not believe that our worldviews function like a web of beliefs. They think there are self-evident, indubitable principles, maxims, etc., things that are doxastically basic. And so we're just simply saying, on what basis are we supposed to know or accept your list of doxastic basicality? So let's take an example. Let's say a Roman Catholic comes and says, all right, I'm ready to refute you. I have my list of doxastically basic principles. And so let's say he lists 10 things. Okay. Blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So you have a list. Now, the way I like to make this argument, to just make it really easy, Father Deacon has papers where he gets really, really in-depth in this. He kind of goes like super formal logic with it. And you can go that route too to show this, but let's make it really easy here. Okay, so wait a minute, Mr. Roman Catholic. You've got a list of 10 things that you said are properly basic. Does that also mean that there's a whole bunch of other beliefs that might be in a separate category or might be based on those 10 things that are not properly basic? Yes, correct. Anything that is not based in sufficient proof and evidence on the 10 principles is not properly basic, but based on the properly basics. Okay. All right. So now you have a delineation problem because now you have another criteria, right? Above the 10 things that you listed, which is a principle by which you know for sure to delineate and put them into the different bins, you see. Do you see how that's a higher separate question? Because now he has a epistemic principle by which not only does he assert the 10 properly basic things, he also says, and I also therefore know by a higher principle all of the other things to not put in the 10 bin, you see. So all you have to do is keep raising the bar and keep asking, okay, well, doesn't this rely on this other principle? And you see the problem for the foundationalist. If the positions keep relying on or referring to other principles, then he's no longer believing in self-evident principles. Let's look at Manion's section on foundationalism and his excellent, just super lucid, super clear, super easy to understand critique of foundationalism. And he says here, those who follow Kant's lead, now he's giving us kind of a moving up through the history of philosophy here, and he's getting up to human Kant. And he says, those who follow Kant's lead gave up trying to describe the world as it actually is, because they realized that all the traditional rational and empirical epistemologies and conceptions of science share a similar underlying structure, they are all foundationalistic. They realize that all the beliefs could be divided into two categories: beliefs that are justified by referring to other beliefs, and beliefs that are not subject to justification, which are the foundations of those beliefs. Okay, do you remember me saying this a minute ago with the Roman Catholic, right? This is it. Right? Remember the Roman Catholic test case guy who said there are 10 foundational self-evident beliefs, and then there's these other ones that are built on that. Well, that's a prior criterion for him to cash those out as either or in those two categories. Okay, but there's no justification for the prior category that's assumed there, you see. And Manion is saying the same thing here. The challenge here, of course, are these foundational beliefs. Rationalists thought that their innate self-evident a priori beliefs were the best candidates. Now, think of Descartes here, right? Descartes is the preeminent rationalist foundationalist, but not every foundationalist is a rationalist. Many foundationalists are Humean empiricists or atheistic scientistic materialists. Okay, so foundationalism nowadays typically encompasses, it's 99% foundationalists are this sort of in the Humean empiricist tradition, right? The positivists and so forth, Vienna school. Every now and then you might find a person who affirms Platonism or some form of Aristotelianism. Those people are there in academia here and there, and they would be foundationalists, but they might be, especially if they're Platonists, they would be a rationalist type of foundationalist. Okay, so just making that clear, and that's why so I could be let's say I could be Thomas Aquinas and have a more empiricist bent to my foundationalism, or I could be Descartes and have a more rationalist bent to my foundationalism. Okay, so any of those can be foundationalist in their approaches. So he says, rationalists thought that their innate self-evident a priori beliefs were the best candidates for grounding their knowledge, what he's saying, and empiricists thought that their sense data impressions were the best candidates. But this discussion has never been advanced beyond Hume. Do you hear me make this point all the time? Have you guys not heard me make this argument at this point 100 times probably? In epistemology, this is still the fundamental issue. And this itself is a kind of a bizarre swinging back and forth for the unbelieving paradigm for philosophers. You have philosophers that are extremely rationalistic, like Hegel. I mean, Hegel would be even more, maybe equally as rationalist as Descartes, right? The real is the rational is the real for Hegel. Okay, that's an extreme rationalism. And for the opposite side, it's not rationalism and reasoning. It's pure raw sense data. Okay, what did we just hear from Sam Harris the other day when we critiqued his Jordan Peterson podcast appearance? Right, the exact opposite. So if I were to try to think of people today, I don't actually know any hardcore Platonists, but if we had a hardcore Platonist come on who wanted to defend Platonism, he might fall into the category of, or a Hegelian, of a foundationalist rationalist, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of who in the modern philosophical world might approximate something like that. And then the opposite position would be anybody from T. Jump to Trent Horn to any kind of empirical based foundationalism. And the reason I said even though Trent used Descartes as a Thomist, Trent falls more in line with the empiricist tradition, because Thomas Aquinas was clearly more of an empiricist in the sense of the peripatetic axiom, right? Aquinas accepts the peripatetic axiom and says there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses. Okay, well, that's definitely more in the empiricist tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't rationalist elements in Aquinas, by the way. So I'm not saying that either, because Aquinas obviously is very influenced by Dionysius. All right. So then Manion goes on to say, the challenge, let's see. This discussion has never advanced beyond Hume, and we should in fact recognize that this is a problem beyond resolution if the object of knowledge is to be the world. And so remember, all of these systems and all of these approaches are trying to ground man's epistemology for knowing and doing things in the world, right? Science, scientific endeavors, they involve manipulating the world, doing things in the world. Engineering, right, involves doing things in the external world. But the question that we're asking in epistemology is, how do we justify our beliefs, our foundational knowledge criterion? Aristotle had already pointed out long ago that our options regarding first truths, self-evident maxims, principles, doxastically basic beliefs, foundations, they are very limited. Okay, this is the point, right? This question has been the same, kind of, from Aristotle all the way up to Aquinas. And this is the same question that Manion is asking of Aristotle, is the same question that I asked of Trent Horn. When asked to justify why we ultimately believe something, we will either give an answer or we will not. If we give an answer, so notice he's cashing this out in a bunch of either ors, which is excellent for the purpose of rhetoric and debate. If we do not give an answer, our belief is arbitrary or fideistic. Remember the atheist guy in the chat today? What did he say? Well, I don't know. I know that I don't know anything. And that's my first foundational belief. Okay. So that falls into the point Manion is making right here, right? His starting point belief is either arbitrary or fideistic. If we do give an answer, then our answer will make reference to some other belief or beliefs. Okay? You guys have heard me saying this throughout today's open forum, that this is the criterion problem. You have a list of the beliefs that you think are self-evident or basic. How do you know that? Oh, well, because it couldn't be otherwise. Oh, well, because it's self-evident. Oh, because of this. Okay. When we were asked to justify those beliefs and so on, in the course of our justifying, we refer oftentimes, he's saying, to some belief that we have already been asked to justify. How many times have we seen this today? Now, let me get you guys the screenshot of the next section. All right, he goes on to say, when we are asked to justify our first beliefs, we will be involved in circular reasoning. If we never refer back to a belief that we've been asked to justify, then we will be involved in an infinite regress. Now, if you paid attention in the Trent debate, both of these things happened. At one point, Trent started going in the infinite regress and justifying his foundational beliefs on other beliefs, and thus making the first beliefs not foundational or self-evident. That would be the infinite regress problem. However, if he thinks that it's self-evident and it's self-evident because we know it's self-evident, that would be circularity, and he would no longer be a foundationalist. None of these replies are satisfactory. A fideistic belief is, by definition, unjustified, and it does not differ epistemologically from its antithesis. Now, this is a great point that we bring up often. Why is this such an important point? Well, remember, if in the process or context of a debate, somebody says, well, my first principles aren't justified, it's just kind of like you just have to start somewhere, man, right? Well, if they're not justified, then I can just as well bring to the debate the opposite of that as my starting point. And there's no way to delineate epistemically which one is correct and which one is false. Because if you start saying the other one is false, then you are no longer you're no longer a fideist about your starting points. If we think it does have an epistemic advantage over its antithesis, then the advantage will be used as a justification. But at that point, we are on our way to circularity or an infinite regress. And again, that's what no foundationalist can admit. An infinite regress is not satisfactory. To say that the justification for a given belief finally comes at the end of an unending series of beliefs is simply to obfuscate the fact that the belief in question is never justified. Exactly. Consequently, an infinite regress is just another fideistic belief and suffers from the same fate. Do you guys understand this? Is this clear? What about just pure circularity? Maybe self-evident beliefs are just circular and they are self-referencing. Now, we're not talking about in the Christian paradigm, right? We're talking about critiquing the foundationalist system. What if a foundationalist says, oh, okay, then now I affirm circularity. Do I escape the problem as a foundationalist? by merely referring to or accepting circularity. Well, this is not satisfactory, Manion says, but it is more interesting. Advocates of a philosophical position called coherentism think that they have beaten the foundational dilemma. They point out that beliefs do not neatly divide into the categories of foundational and justified. All of our beliefs are related to one another in the form of a coherent web, right? Now, Manion is bringing in here the response to foundationalists that coherentists have. And they have this because they are recognizing the circularity of these starting points. Does that mean, again, let's avoid confusion because people always get confused over this too. Does that mean that I am affirming a secular coherentist view of epistemology because I'm using this argument? No. So remember, guys, a lot of confusion is generated out there by people thinking that to use an argument from a system or from a school or from a philosopher entails that you believe that system or that philosopher's worldview. It does not. If I use an argument from the forms or from the realm of the ideas, that does not make me an idealist. If I make an argument from empirical sense data, that does not make me an empiricist. If I make an argument from, I don't know, what else is there? If I think Hegel made a good argument about this or that, does that make me a Hegelian, right? No, of course not. If I make an argument from Van Til, does that make me a reformed Van Tilian? Not necessarily. So remember, let's not confuse arguments with the people who make the arguments. You can pull out an argument in terms of its form, and that is irrespective and irrelevant to the person or the individual who made the argument. All right, so let's get back to Manion. Manion says, this point of circularity and coherence isn't going to work. Because even though it's an insightful critique of the foundationalist system or approach, let's see why it also fails ultimately. And this again needs to be said because still everybody out there thinks that we are coherentists. Oh, you're not a foundationalist. Oh, you're a coherence theory of truth guy. I could easily refute you. Did I ever say I affirmed the secular coherence view of epistemology? No. All we're doing is saying they have an insight and a good critique of the foundationalists. All of our beliefs are related to one another in a form of a coherent web. I agree with that. That is an excellent insight to move us in the direction of what we could call epistemic holism. Some subset of our beliefs may be more important and juridical to other beliefs, but all of our beliefs hang or fall on other beliefs, and thus, the coherentist argues, nothing is actually foundational per se, or foundational in the sense of self-evident. Okay? Again, doesn't mean that I can't use the term foundational as if some beliefs are foundational to other beliefs. Sure, right? And did you notice that Manion says that right there? That's the very point you hear me making all the time. Sure, you could say that some beliefs are foundational to other beliefs. The transcendental categories are foundational to the possibility of knowledge or beliefs, but that does not entail foundationalism. And even Trent didn't grasp that. But as Michael DePaul says in his article on coherentism, as he points out, coherentism doesn't really escape the foundational problem at all. It is actually another version of foundationalism that holds that all beliefs are foundational. He says regarding the coherentist solution of the problem of circularity, quote, but coherentism seems to be a non-starter. For if no belief in the chain is justified to begin with, then there is nothing to pass along. Altering the metaphor, we might say that coherentism seems about as likely to succeed as a bucket brigade does, not at the end of a well, but simply moves around in a circle. The bottom line is this: we must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification. Does everyone hear that? That is the point that I have been hammering about 50 times today. Do you guys see this? Let's read it again. The bottom line is this. I'm just repeating Manion's point, Manion's argument. We must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification. And that's not a typo. It's a brilliant way to state this problem. And in order to do that, and so he says, and we have to do that, so that we can determine our criteria of justification. And he's pointing out how kind of like stuck in this circle or in this infinite regress the foundationalist or the coherentist is. We must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification so that we can use it to determine our criteria of justification. If we recognize that this is a problem that is in principle unsolvable, this is the whole point, guys. The point here is not to accept foundationalism, not to accept coherentism. The point is to say this is unsolvable. Then we will realize and save ourselves considerable time and headache by not chasing a bunch of dumb solutions that don't work. And they only appear to work because they obfuscate the problem. Yes, exactly. Now I think these quotes, if I recall, in this next section, Nicholas Everett, that one's really good. We might as well just go ahead and launch into the next part of this. All right. So this is a great quote here, if I recall. Nicholas Everett in his book here, just again, guys, just standard epistemology text. Nicholas Everett in his book Modern Epistemology says of the current state of analysis, quote, "The search for foundations has been unsuccessful. It has failed in mathematics. It has failed in science. All particular proposals have failed, and it fails in principle." Everett concludes with this question: Given this inevitable failure, what, if anything, is left for the epistemologist to do? So when you guys have heard me repeating this point over and over and over, that there's nowhere else left to go with foundationalism, and that modern epistemology is at a dead end because of this, that's why you hear me constantly bringing back in Hume. And it's not to accept Hume, it's to point out Hume's good arguments. Yes, Hume can make a good argument on an empiricist ground, on an empiricist system, in the atheist worldview. Doesn't mean I think Hume is a good man. Doesn't mean I think Hume's system is correct or his worldview is right. Hume is the consistent atheist. That's the point here, you see. We want to drive the atheist, drive the opponent to consistency on his own grounds. That's what we are doing in apologetics and in this exercise. That's what we do, okay? It's not to convince people of Humeanism. It's not to make people skeptics. It's to make people realize that the end result of their presuppositions should lead them logically to skepticism. And if they are led to skepticism, their position falls apart and they don't have an argument against God, against theism, against Christianity. That's the point. Manion says, as we've already seen, the foundationalist can provide no justification for his belief in causality, identity, externality, the self, logic, induction, etc. And if you want to see the rest of that, that's in the paper. I will link the paper. You can go read the Manion paper for yourself. But the skeptic would give these problems a little more emphasis and, in fact, draw our attention to more problems. Now, when he launches into this external world problem, that's the section, that's the argument that he will appropriate that you heard me use earlier, right? Remember how I kept stressing the problem from Kant earlier? The phenomenal noumenal question. How do we know that our conceptual mental schema that we think is logic and reasoning and abstract concepts, how do we know that that matches up to anything in the external world? Right? I'm not agreeing with Kant. I'm appropriating this question as a defeater for foundationalism. As we have seen, the foundationalists can raise the bar and say, hey, what about the external world? We have already seen from Berkeley to Hume that man cannot justify his belief in the external world. Kant said it was one of the greatest scandals of science and philosophy that there was no proof of the existence of the external world. But we can make no distinction between our because we can make no distinction between our internal world of thought and the external world on atheist empiricist grounds, okay, on the unbelieving ground, on the rationalist grounds, not on the orthodox grounds. Okay, I'm not affirming this when I read this or say this. This is an argument for their position, on their position. Okay, so people out there who get confused, I am not affirming this view. I am speaking of and explaining an argument, not my view. It is a good argument against this view. Because we got a lot of slow boys that get caught up in this. They can't tell the difference between making an argument and accepting that position. And so if I was an empiricist, if I was a rationalist, if I was in any of these systems, the problem of the external world is a completely valid question to ask. It is not a problem for the Christian paradigm because we do not have these starting points. Do you see that? That's the point. I am not a foundationalist. I don't begin my beliefs from empirical data starting points. I don't begin my worldview, my system, from rationalism or the cogito. So I do not have these problems in my worldview because I do not accept these position starting points. If you do not accept my worldview, the Christian paradigm, then you will be subject to these problems. That's the point here. Now, maybe you think you're not subject to these problems. Okay. Feel free to come and bring your argument as to why you are not caught in these problems. Now, the last 500 years of epistemology says we're all caught in these problems in secular academia and in unbelief. But now, if you're an outlier and you've solved this, you are more than welcome to come on and give your solution to these problems. Again, Kant said is one of the greatest scandals of science and philosophy that there's not actually a proof of the existence of the external world. Because we can make no distinction between our internal world of thought, okay, that's what I meant by conceptual schema, right? And the external world, we cannot know what we call the external world is not just a form of our internal world. So do you understand that to an empiricist or even to a rationalist, this is a devastating critique? Because it means that their system cannot justify any statements about the world. You can have all kinds of beliefs about the world, but you're not going to be able to justify those beliefs without solving this insoluble dilemma to these systems. Again, does everybody see this? It's not a very difficult point. In fact, it's in a scandalous way really simple. And it does not mean for the 1,000th time, slow boys, that I agree with Kantianism. Kant is saying, there is this problem. I am the Immanuel Kant. I'm from Germany, Austria. I don't even remember if he was from Austria or not, but we'll say he is. There is the problem from Hume. David Hume has given us this problem of the external world. And if you read from David Hume, you will devise a series of problems that cannot be answered. And if we agree that the world is either a mental construct, or if we agree that knowledge begins with sense data, we cannot prove that there is an external world. Good. So there's my Kant impression. Of course, we don't have any. There's no proof of Kant's inflection and tone. There's a YouTube video that you can go watch the interview with David with Immanuel Kant if you want. That's a joke, dummies. So that's what's being said here, right? Now, from the Christian perspective, that's I can sit here and say, oh, thank you, Immanuel. That's actually a really good insight and a really good argument for these secular unbelieving systems that they're false, fraudulent, and they fail. So thank you for that argument, Kant. By the way, I don't accept your system because your system basically makes knowledge impossible also. So you guys see that this presuppositional critique applies as well to Kant, right, and his system. So we're not Kantian. And in fact, Kant's system is a gigantic failure. It's ridiculous. It's just another version of human system building. Now, does Kant have insights? Yes, he does. And his insight here is to say, hey guys, how are we going to answer these problems that Hume has raised? How are we going to do science if we can't prove there's an external world? And by the way, if you read the Scientific Outlook, Bertrand Russell says this is still the case. No one has proven the external world. And that's in the first few chapters of Scientific Outlook. And Bertrand Russell says, but we're just going to set this aside and move on because we can't solve this problem. He says that in the book. He's like, yeah, okay, so from Hume and Kant all the way up till now, there's no proof of the external world. But I don't know, man. Let's just act like there is an external world. And that's literally what philosophy and science do, is they say, look, dude, we'll just ignore this question. We're going to pretend that there is an external world. Therefore, we cannot know that the external world even exists. Quine admits, quote, again, representing this tradition, the empiricist tradition in the 20th century, physical objects are conceptually imported as convenient intermediaries. Did you hear this? The notion that there are physical objects that are conceptually imported into our worldview, into our theory, into our epistemology, our theory of knowledge, are convenient intermediaries. They are comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer. Do you guys remember how many times we've had atheists come in and say, oh, do you believe in sentences, meaning, concepts, the external world? And every atheist, yes, I do. Oh, okay, so then that's literally of the same ontological epistemic status as the gods of Homer.
What? That's crazy. How dare you? That's insane. You don't even know what you're talking about, word salad.
I'm repeating the argument from one of the most famous philosophical essays of the 20th century. Quine's point right here. He's not saying that the gods of Homer are real. He's not saying physical objects are the gods. Okay, slow boys. No, he's saying conceptually imported notions like physical objects are of the same epistemic status as the gods of Homer, because neither of them can be justified or known for sure to exist or be the case without assuming them to exist and be the case. For my part, Quine says, I do believe in physical objects, and I do not believe in Homer's gods. But when it comes to the point of epistemic footing, physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Exactly. Thank you so much, WVO Quine, because you are giving great ammo to us apologists, to us who look at epistemology in terms of worldviews and paradigms, and who can never get tired of pointing out to the atheist materialist that your belief in meaning, your belief in abstract objects and concepts, in logic, literally has no better footing than the gods of Homer in your worldview, in your paradigm, in your system. The self. We should also make note of a few more observations about our notion of the self, because this has been the autonomous man's most confident assertion. Okay, so let's shift away from the empiricism of Hume and Kant to Descartes' cogito. I think, therefore I am. Man has at least been confident of his own existence. But what exactly does the term self refer to? Who are you? Are you a dream? Are you an idea? Are you an idea in the mind of a god or a demon? Right? And then Manion goes on to repeat the arguments that you heard me make of the cogito. I'm not going to repeat that for the 10th time today. But again, so if you do want to hear the critiques of the cogito, you can rewind about, 30 minutes, an hour. And we went through all of those, and Manion will go on to make those very critiques. All right, so let's move past that, because that was, I think, really good overview of the critique of the foundationalist enterprise in the history of philosophy. All of the worldviews out there, all of man's systems, for the most part, right, unless it's another religious system, are going to essentially be a form of autonomous epistemology, reasoning as if there's no God, and then the human mind and reasoning faculty will determine down the road if there is a place for some kind of God. Well, of course, that kind of God is no kind of God, actually. And so that's why for our position, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. Andrew, $5. If I said, I am God and I am the standard of truth, and then I asked myself, how is that possible? And then I went back to the former statement, Is that epistemic bootstrapping and circularity? Yes. So when Manion is asking these questions of jumpstart, right? That's epistemic bootstrapping. Okay, well, I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to build my worldview from this. Remember in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris podcast, right? About the middle of that, when we were critiquing it, Sam Harris starts saying, just give me raw experience with no presuppositions, nothing theory laden. I just want to boil down to meditate to get some raw sense data experience and then try to build up from there. That is epistemic bootstrapping par excellence. And so your example was, I am God and I'm the standard of truth. Yeah, I think that would be a cult leader's attempt at epistemic bootstrapping, right? So yeah, we could say all the cult leaders are engaged in this to a degree because their final reference point for for authority and for epistemic certitude is themselves in their own God status. Andrew, $5. How is God more certain than I? I'm Orthodox, but this is a question that's been bothering me. Well, because, again, if you want to ask, it's a question of starting points, right? So if we're asking a question about certitude in relation to starting points, why? I mean, well, let's put it this way. In terms of objective factuality, in our view, the certitude of your existence and the certitude of the proposition God exists is the same, right? It's not like there's something inherently more certain about the propositions themselves. But in the domain of metaphysics, God's existence is more necessary, more certain, because God's existence is necessary for you to be able to say, I exist. So I would cash that out as two different domains, right? Epistemically speaking, the truthfulness is the same. But in terms of metaphysics, you couldn't have the epistemology at all if God himself didn't exist and ground epistemology as a whole. So they're two different domains. One's a paradigm level, right, with the question of God's existence. But Descartes' cogito is not a foundation for any kind of paradigm. And that's the point of the critique of the cogito.
It seems like your system includes like some form of coherentism and fideism, but how do you avoid like having to answer those pitfalls that those systems fall into?
Well, the point of that whole exercise is to say that it's a holistic system that's in question here. So in other words, what's at dispute between me and the atheist, for example, isn't this or that fact or this or that principle or point or starting point. What's ultimately at dispute is two completely different paradigms of philosophy, two different paradigms of how we give an account for knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics. That's the point of the transcendental argument, is that it's a comparison of paradigms. You can't resolve the dispute or the debate by this or that specific detail or fact. That's why it's epistemic holism.
But then doesn't that fall into the critique that you said of the Roman Catholic guy earlier, where you're saying if I can't imagine anything else being the case?
No, because it's not stopping with that. I might say that your system is self-defeating or leads to absurdity, but I'm not stopping there. There's the additional point that my system actually can give an account and a justification for the possibility of knowledge. So it goes one step further than that. If it just stopped with saying that, well, I don't see how it could be any other way because your system is reduced to absurdity, that might be a valid critique. But we're going beyond that and we're saying, but also my worldview actually does give an account for knowledge. It does give justification.
Okay. And I guess that's, so in your account, I guess, if it has these elements of fideism or, coherentism, how do you give the account with avoiding those pitfalls that you just kind of went over?
Right, because number one, I'm not a foundationalist, so I'm not making the point that my starting point for knowledge is arbitrary or just some random thing. That's why we're arguing that this is the strong point for revelational epistemology. That's why theonomous reasoning and using scripture and the Christian worldview as my starting point itself doesn't subject me to these problems. Because how do I know that I can trust, for example, let's take Hume's problem of induction, right? This fundamental problem of how do we know the future will be like the past? How do I know there's an external world? Well, my answer is God created the world. The world operates in a regular fashion through divine providence, and that gives me a basis for belief in induction. God has promised that the seasons will continue in their succession until the end of the world. And so all of these things actually do give an account for an explanation for how regularity in nature is possible. I have a belief in logic because I believe in abstract principles which are grounded ultimately in the mind of God. So I have all of these arguments that I can make that explain and give an account. That's my story, basically, of how man has the possibility of knowledge. And so when I contrast my story with the atheist story, and that's why I'm using the word story here. I don't mean in the sense of just made up. I'm saying you have a story, I have a story. You have assumptions, I have assumptions. You have starting points, I have starting points. We're not going to resolve it by picking out this or that starting point. We're going to resolve the dispute, the debate in the transcendental argument by comparing whose story can make sense of the possibility of knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics.
Okay, and so I guess, would you say the starting point, I mean, that might be a bad term, but would be revelation?
Yeah, if you do want to use there's nothing wrong with the word starting point itself, right? I mean, part of the point in Manion's paper is that, the jumpstart question is a question for anybody. And so for me, as an Orthodox Christian, well, my starting point is divine revelation. So that's what grounds and gives me an account for the world, the past, the future, the self, abstract concepts, logic, etc. That's my starting point. It's not the only thing I look to. I mean, I have a high view of logic and reasoning, so all of those things factor in. But I'm not going to assume atheism and then pick, because I can't do that. Like, it doesn't make sense in my system, right? My worldview, it wouldn't make sense in my worldview. It would be contradictory against my worldview for me to act like there are self-evident principles and I can pretend that God doesn't exist to have common ground with an atheist. It's not even honest to do that.
Right. So I think what an atheist might think there was they would try to then put revelation into one of these categories. Like, they'd say revelation has to be based on like faith only, or revelation has to be based on,
but it's not, right? So
those things you're saying?
Well, it can't be reduced to any of those things. So in other words, let me put it this way. What is being argued for is an entire paradigm, and that includes divine revelation, God's existence, the incarnation, the Bible, the history of the church. All of those things are actually part of the argument.
Okay, but would those things all have been learned through revelation?
No, hold on. Not all of those things. So some of those things are, the content is divine revelation. Some of those things are history. Some of those things are logic. Some of those things are, all kinds of different things. Like, I mean, I believe that I have I'm a self. I believe in the existence of the self. But I am not divine revelation per se.
Okay, so that's where it can sort of look like a coherent type of view, but
there is an element of coherentism, yeah.
Right, I see what you're saying.
Because it's epistemic holism, correct?
Yeah, I guess I've always tried to understand. Well, obviously Revelation doesn't neatly fit into one of these categories, but try to explain it to maybe like a materialist or someone who wants those type of definitions, like to try to explain revelation to somebody. They're like, well, it's just it's just this guy in a cave who didn't eat a bunch of foods experiences, or it's just someone's interpretation of this scripture that was given to them through God. Like, that's maybe how they would understand revelation.
That's true. Yeah. Right. So our presupposition, I understand that that's how they would view it, but no, our presupposition is different, and it's operating on the assumption of inspiration. So we think it is the Word of God. And so divine revelation for us is, the body of doctrines that Christ and the apostles handed down to the church. So for us, that's the content of divine revelation, both written and oral. So for us, that's the totality story, that we have to make make sense of the world and give justification, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not exclusive, or that's not mutually exclusive to philosophy, to logic, to science, to any of those domains. We think all those domains make perfect sense within the Christian worldview and paradigm. I mean, if God exists and has created a world that operates with regularity, if there's free will, if there's man has dignity because he's made in the image of God, then we have a basis for ethics, for morals. If the world has an end by which it's directed by an intentional being, then there's telos, there's purpose. God creates a world with beings that have their own causal agency. Now we have causality. I mean, on and on and on. These principles and problems that historically plague secular philosophy aren't really problems if the Christian paradigm is true, right? So does that mean that I'm just saying, well, it's true because I think it's true? No, I'm saying the proof for it being true is that if it was not true in all of these different aspects and components in a holistic way, then knowledge would ultimately become impossible. That's the argument.
Okay, right. So it's not so much like, yeah, it's almost like these things that were learned through revelation, the more science and just the more that life exists, these things are proven through all these other methods to be the case, as opposed to just sort of saying,
yeah, kind of, yeah. I mean, I think that science does attest to design and a creator, but if you were arguing with an atheist, he's going to say, well, you're just assuming and interpreting it as design, but it may not be. So I don't use design arguments and these kinds of things typically, because ultimately that's not what the debate is, right? I'm going to take the debate with a guy that says that to a more fundamental level about the possibility of knowledge at all. And that's what we were just today was focusing on that. Why is epistemology such a big deal? Why do I keep bringing the debate back to that question with these people? That's all I was trying to do today. But there are times, you're right, when maybe we do need to look at the testimony of science and evidences, right? So I'm not opposed to evidences. I just don't think evidences function on their own without a paradigm, without a theory.
Right, and then that you just laid out there is distinct from what the Roman Catholic guy that you had mentioned. I got on after that discussion,
Correct.
But that he was trying to say, like,
Right.
I can't see the opposite as being the case, as opposed to saying, like, your worldview that you're saying, it's not like just my perspective, I can't see it. Like, no one has been able to put out a defeater for this. Like, there's never been another worldview that can get put together that can give an account for knowledge.
Right. So basically, again, partly for the Roman Catholic, they're bound to a foundationalist epistemology, I would argue. Now, maybe there's some Roman Catholic out there who thinks they're not. I mean, I don't see how they could make sense of that in their view, just because there's just so many dogmatic and, traditional Roman Catholic views and statements about, Aquinas, his importance, the catechism's discussions of the classical arguments, classical theism seems just bound up with the Roman Catholic tradition. So maybe there's a Roman Catholic out there who could argue that they're not a foundationalist. I don't see how that's tenable or possible, but 99.9% of them aren't that way. So let's set that aside for the moment. And the approach that a Roman Catholic has is going to be constrained by the problems of foundationalism. So all I'm doing with those debates with those people is just repeating the arguments of David Hume. Basically, that's it. And that's all the paper today was doing. And the smartest amongst them, you're correct, will respond by saying, well, Aristotle responds to this argument with retorsion, where he says there's not really any other way to do philosophy or to do logic if you don't assume these things. And I totally agree with that. The only problem is that still doesn't grant a foundationalist epistemic justification. And that's why this is so crucial.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, so there's them saying nothing else works doesn't prove what they're saying works.
Exactly, because I have a defeater for that. Because I can bring in David Hume or the brain in the vat, or Father Deegan uses the schizophrenics, right? Like, what if we're just schizophrenics and we think that reality, right, matches up to logic and to our first principles, but it really doesn't, but we're just duped into thinking it does? Or what if, the Manion paper was making the argument for the defeater for that is to say, well, maybe we're just psychologically predisposed to think that our mental categories like logic and our abstract concepts match up to the external world. But how do we know that they do? And if a foundationalist tries to bring in all these other arguments, then that foundational belief isn't actually foundational anymore. It wasn't self-evident.
Right. Makes sense.
Hold on, let me. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
But what if they were to say that same kind of schizophrenic idea, but they just put that with the, Orthodox worldview of God? That this is something that was just kind of cooked up and conceived by.
Well, the point is that the problem of the external world isn't a problem for a Christian, because he believes God created the world, because divine revelation says there is an external world. It's created by God to operate in a regular fashion, divine providence, etc. So it's only a problem for a person who adopts a system that's going to be built from the ground up by human sense data, you see.
Right.
Or Descartes' rationalism. Either of those systems is a human system building project that is only a problem for the person who says, my starting point, think about Descartes' starting point. I think, therefore I am. It's a totally autonomous, human-oriented human starting point. What does God say? I am that I am. And now I'm just contrasting these two statements because for the Christian, for the Orthodox Christian, his epistemology is going to be directed towards and based on a self-revealing, self-referencing God who says, I am that I am, and man must submit to that for his world to work, for his system to work, to be coherent, etc. But Descartes, David Hume, any of these people, their system is, I start with me. The only difference between Hume and Descartes is Descartes says, I start with my mind. My mind is the beginning of all predication and rationality. Hume says, no, it's my sense data. My sense data is the starting point for all knowledge, right?
Right.
And so now you've bitten off a big chunk problem in epistemology. Okay, so build your system, make it work, but none of it's going to work until you justify your first principles.
Yeah. No, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you guys.